Well, here's something that came up in some of my conversations with customers. They're required to print and have hard copies of documents, and they're required to print out documents.
Mm-hmm.
How might ECM assist those types of organizations? One where, you know, it would seem to make sense. Here we are with our BlackBerry and our iPhone again, but it would seem to make sense if you go out in the field and you're able to have an electronic receipt and able to work with a customer in that manner, for example. But you can't. You have to have a paper document. How would you? Would there be any insights into how you
Perhaps
ECM might be able to?
Had they tried any alternatives to the situation as you just described it?
Mm-hmm. They didn't say.
They didn't say.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, ECM by itself isn't going to change the rules or regulations that govern that particular institution.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are ways to mitigate the cost, even of managing that document once the physical version has been completed and approved. The first that comes to mind, of course, is to scan it back into an electronic records repository.
Sure.
So at least you reduce the cost of having to maintain N number of square footage to store documents, the boxes, and thus the boxes in the rooms that they consume for that purpose. It also makes it easier to retrieve them. In fact, you can retrieve them and review specific elements of the document or specific pages without having to print them out all over again. So you see some cost savings associated with that as well.
Sure. And so there actually is a way for ECM to be able to assist those types of institutions and organizations.
Yeah, even if regulations or laws prevent the complete webification, if you will,
Sure.
of the creation to retention scope of the life cycle of that contract or document.
Absolutely. Now, one of the other things that you and I discussed was workflow.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that was such a hot topic many, many moons ago, and whole companies were built on workflow. But workflow really does have its purpose, particularly in ECM, and specifically as we discuss document management collaboration from this perspective.
I would agree. It's funny because I think we often think of workflow as being somewhat new. And yet workflows have existed for as long as people have exchanged information in a business process, going
Sure.
back hundreds of years.
So you're saying that the Egyptians actually had some sort of workflow as they were building
There was
the pyramids?
probably some sort of hieroglyphic that, you know,
I
of
see.
course the document was a little bit heavier than you needed hundreds of guys to move it back and forth. But even if you just think back to, I remember when I was entering the workforce, the common workflow could be seen. It was a document that someone needed to get from one office to another, and it went into a sort of a yellowish brown colored envelope with a red little piece of string that attached to a round doohickey, and there would be pages, or rather lines, where everyone could sign receipt and approval and off to the next person. And there was some person who ran around the building and up and down the elevators with a cart. And that was the epitome of a workflow.
I do remember
not
that.
too long ago.
Believe it or not.
I'm afraid that still exists in some organizations.
It does very much.
Today. And so are there ways to save money by employing workflow and using the features in an enterprise content management system to automate that process? Absolutely. So let's just take a somewhat common example of an organization that we happen to know, I think both of us, who took what was a physical workflow process, the ingestion of documents into a process where those documents had to be scanned, and I mean that by simply being read, being deemed worthy of moving on to the next stage, and ultimately becoming part of a submission, which would be part of what a graduate medical intern would have to go through in order to be qualified for consideration into a program.
Mm-hmm.
So,
know the program well.
Fast forward to today, this institution now ingests the documents via scan. The scanners are able to use OCR and other methods to capture the content of those documents and automatically categorize them associated to the metadata that's being created as a result of that capture, and then categorize them based on the metadata that's generated. And as a result of that categorization, you've got a workflow that's being initiated which will guide the document to the necessary next person who is participating in that particular workflow. In this case, it would be a reviewer. And there are multiple reviewers associated with the process. If enough reviewers approve, then it goes to the next level.